all right?" "I'm all right." I start crying. I can't stop thinking about it, you know. I am aware. No, pay attention. It simply never stops. At one point, Jazz Jennings was praised for being a pioneer, an icon of a new transgender visibility age. From stardom on reality TV to viral interviews, she represented advancement, bravery, and validation. However, a more agonizing reality surfaced behind the spotlight. What occurs when a youngster loses the ability to be a person and instead becomes a movement? This is the tale of what we witnessed and what we failed to notice. The youngest changeover in America. Like many children's tales, it started out innocently enough with a youngster stating a straightforward truth. Despite being designated male at birth, Jazz Jennings, who was born in South Florida in 2000, started expressing her gender identity at the age of 2. She would say, "I'm not a boy. I'm a female. Without a doubt, I am a girl. That's all I think of myself as." Her parents, Greg and Jeanette, initially thought it might be a passing phase, but the demands only grew more intense. Jazz's parents had to make the difficult choice of either supporting or rejecting their child's declared gender as she sobbed uncontrollably about having to wear boy clothes and use male pronouns. Jazz had finished her social change by the time she was 5. She had long hair, dressed like a girl, and went by her chosen name, Jazz. She was practically living the life of a girl. However, this was not merely a personal family choice. It was on the verge of being well known. In an interview with Barbara Walters on ABC's 2020 and 2007, Jazz became one of the world's youngest and most well-known transgender people. The part was revolutionary. As a vivacious 6-year-old revealed her identity with clarity beyond her years, a nation watched in wonder and bewilderment. Walters appeared in disbelief. The public was split. The Jennings family received praise from some for their empathy and tolerance. They were accused by others of forcing their child into a strict label too soon. What would turn into a conflagration was ignited by Jazz's dazzling eyes on national television. She was no longer a youngster. She served as a cultural symbol and a spark for a growing international discussion about gender identity, childhood, and medicine. But something much more intricate was going on behind the scenes. Authenticity was only one aspect of Jazz's story. It has to do with narrative control and the importance of representation. Jazz's mother, Jeanette Jennings, became a significant influence in her daughter's life. She was very involved, fiercely protective, and committed to paving the way for other trans kids as well as Jazz. By scheduling interviews, setting up appearances, and eventually managing production on I Am Jazz, the TLC reality series that would follow Jazz through adolescence, she established herself as the de facto spokesman for trans adolescent parenting. Was it orchestration or support, though? Jazz's life became inextricably linked to the media apparatus after that. She was followed by reality TV cameras to therapy sessions, the doctor's office, school, and even times when she had time to think. She became a role model for thousands of people, gave speaking engagements, and published a children's book. Even still, there were indications of underlying stress and emotional load that grew more intense every year. Jazz wasn't simply being honest with herself. In front of millions, she was doing it on cue. Paused puberty. Jazz's family made yet another audacious and contentious decision as she got closer to adolescence. Jazz started taking puberty blockers at age 11 under medical supervision. By suppressing the natural onset of puberty, these medications stopped male secondary sex traits including genital growth, voice deepening, and facial hair from developing. Her family and doctors portrayed it as a medical necessity, a means of avoiding the trauma of going through puberty that would go against who she was. This was a progressive and affirming step forward for many in the medical and activism sectors. Others, however, posed queries that are still relevant today. Was Jazz too young to agree to something so permanent? Choice. Could a child really comprehend the long-term effects of stopping a child's natural development? Estrogen, a cross-sex hormone, was used to feminize Jazz's body after the blockers. At 14, her physical growth was consistent with that of a cisgender girl. Her voice had not deepened, and her physique remained tiny. She seemed happy and self-assured on the surface, but doubts started to creep in. Jazz started secretly recording journal entries and video diaries. She admitted, "I feel like I'm living a lie. I don't feel like me," in one especially disturbing scene that appeared on I Am Jazz. For many, that admission raised red flags. Jazz had been portrayed for years as the perfect example of a transgender youngster's success story: content, healthy, and prospering. Yet here she was, sitting by herself, perplexed and doubting herself. The uneasiness was no longer only sentimental. It was existential. The effects of delaying puberty on the mind and body have long been a topic of discussion among psychologists. Hormones aren't the only factor in puberty. It concerns emotional control, cognitive development, and identity creation. Had Jazz lost something intangible by avoiding this process? Critics said that by halting Jazz's growth, adults had also stopped her ability to think critically or change. She had never experienced the natural maturation process, peer development, or private identity exploration. Every stage of her journey of self-discovery had been influenced, recorded, and celebrated in public. Jazz's experience became a case study when the political discourse surrounding puberty blockers became more prevalent. Her narrative validated early intervention for proponents. It served as a sobering warning to opponents. Additionally, Jazz herself was gradually losing her ability to bear the weight of expectations, being the ideal trans person, constantly smiling, and constantly promoting. She wrote more than just pleas for assistance in her diary. They were indicators. This was not freedom. This was a life that was becoming more and more detached from oneself. The procedure that made all the difference. Jazz Jennings' story became a case study in early gender change by the time she was 17, praised in forums for trans advocacy, medical courses, and intellectual communities. Beneath the praise, however, a complex medical reality was emerging, one that not even her doctors had completely expected. Jazz had gender confirmation surgery, which involves creating a neo-vagina, in 2018. It was seen as a turning point for the transgender youth movement as a whole, as well as for Jazz personally. She was one of the youngest people in the United States at the time to have this permanent surgery. But the joyous mood soon changed. Her physicians were honest on I Am Jazz. Jazz had not developed enough penile tissue to employ in the construction of the vaginal canal because she had been on puberty blockers at a very young age. This was an anatomical consequence of the same medical path that her transition had depended on. To make up for the shortage of material, surgeons had to innovate and use skin grafts from her stomach. It was a sensitive, dangerous business. Within days, complications developed. Jazz experienced severe pain, inflammation, and healing problems. Far from being a one-time occurrence, the initial surgery marked the start of a torturous medical journey. She had several follow-up procedures to address infections and structural issues. The physical and psychological toll is increased with each procedure. In a subsequent interview, Jazz stated, "I've had a lot of surgeries. Even though I've had many issues, the quiet times, the ones that were recorded off stage or during confessional scenes, were the ones that showed the deeper harm." Once renowned for her contagious positivity, Jazz started to crumble under the strain of her life. She described feeling unlike herself, numb, and disassociated. Her words, "I feel kind of broken," were honest. The impact of the statement extended well beyond the screen. It made both proponents and detractors reevaluate a harsh reality. Despite being life-saving for some, gender-affirming surgery can be extremely dangerous, particularly if done when a person is young, in front of cameras, and with little long-term studies to support the procedure. What was supposed to be Jazz's journey's symbolic climax, her complete affirmation, became the beginning of a more sinister phase. Emotionally spent, physically damaged, and now unable to accept the fact that their body was rebuilt under extreme strain. Jazz has evolved beyond its pioneering status. She was a patient recuperating from both surgery and the demands of a society that had made her its face. Depression, loneliness, and weight gain. Jazz Jennings gradually and suddenly stepped away from the limelight following the operation. She posted less things on social media. She became less visible. She was changed when she came back. She was quieter, heavier, and more reserved. The talented youngster who once motivated millions has started a personal struggle with mental illness. By her early 20s, Jazz disclosed that she had put on more than 100 pounds. What started off as recuperation from surgery evolved into episodes of binge eating, where people would consume whole pizzas, boxes of donuts, or thousands of calories in one sitting. Gaining weight was an indicator as well as a symptom. There was a problem. On the broadcast she admitted, "I'm spiraling. My coping strategy is food." Emotional changes accompanied the physical ones. Anxiety exacerbated the onset of depression. She frequently had trouble getting out of bed. It was daunting to have to do things like go to therapy or brush her teeth. Jazz appeared lost in spite of her parents' steadfast support, particularly that of her mother Jeanette. Jeanette faces her daughter in a moment of despair in one of the terrifying scenes from I Am Jazz. "It doesn't make sense what you're stating. All I want is for you to love who you are. Why is that so difficult?" Jazz looked straight ahead, untalking. The audience witnessed a daughter who wasn't sure if she could even be reached, and a mother who was anxious to save her daughter off the edge. The show's early episodes, when Jazz had appeared invincible, smart beyond her years and unstoppable, stood in sharp contrast to the emotional intensity of the moment. The academic digression followed. A remarkable accomplishment for anyone, but particularly for someone who had lived under such close surveillance, was Jazz's acceptance to Harvard University. However, Jazz postponed enrolling at Cambridge instead of going right away. "I need time to heal," she explained. Fans were astonished by the choice. Jazz had long served as a representation of advancement and promise, a real-life example of what it meant to be a successful transgender young person. Admitting that she wasn't okay, she was now taking a step back. She dispelled the myth that her shift had been seamless or effortless by doing this. This was no longer the tale of an innovator shattering stereotypes. It was about a young woman who was alone because of her celebrity, depressed, and trying to take back control of a life that had never really been hers. Was it premature or excessive? The question that no one had dared to ask during Jennings' ascent became louder as the years went by, and her once bright grin faded behind layers of emotional exhaustion. Was it all too much? Is it too soon? Even proponents of early gender affirmation had to pause and think. Under its glossy exterior, Jazz's story, which had previously served as the inspiration for school rules, TED speeches, and medical regulations, now showed alarming flaws. Could a 5 or even 11-year-old child truly understand the long-term health effects of a shift that would change not just the body but also the mind? Following a controversial 2023 article in Spiked Online headlined "The Tragedy of Jazz," it became impossible to ignore this painful line of inquiry. Jennings. The article didn't hold back. It accused the adults in Jazz's life, her parents, doctors, and media personalities, of outsourcing her health care to a charity. It asserted that Jazz had evolved from a person to a symbol. Someone who was ensnared in a story that was well-intentioned but unrelentingly affirming, preventing pause, ambiguity, or investigation. On her show, Jazz offered disturbing truths that were frequently overshadowed by cheerful editing or chirpy soundtracks, raising questions among critics about whether she had been deprived of her natural psychological development, intimacy with her own fluctuating emotions, and perhaps most tragically, the ability to say, "I'm not sure." The image of a successful, self-assured young woman gives way to that of a bewildered, possibly traumatized adolescent, unsure about her body, her desires, and even her future as a romantic being. When Jazz admits in one particularly startling scene, "I don't experience sexual attraction to anyone. I don't know if I ever will," her voice is monotone, and her expression is blank. These weren't attacks on trans identity per se. Rather, they were critiques of a social, medical, and cultural system that had arguably treated Jazz as an ideological prototype, rather than a living, breathing, evolving child. The media had chronicled her transition step by step, but few had questioned why at each stage. Why had hormone blockers been introduced so early? Why had surgery been scheduled before adulthood? Why hadn't anyone on record questioned the psychological trade-offs?
The affirming narrative, it seemed, had left no room for discomfort, no room for growing pains, no room for saying wait, and that omission may have cost jazz her peace, the disintegration of a movement's mascot. As more stories of regret or complicated outcomes emerged from other early transitioners, Jazz's story started to seem not only unique but emblematic. At her peak, Jazz Jennings was more than just a name. She was a symbol, a bright, talkative teenager who appeared on her own reality show, authored best-selling books, spoke at colleges, and even sparked legislation. She was everything trans advocacy organizations could ask for: smart, kind, non-threatening, media-savvy, and a symbol of progress. However, the pedestal is never a safe place to stand. By her early 20s, that meticulously maintained image started to fall apart, and Jazz was no longer the unwavering representation of trans success. She was publicly battling post-surgical trauma, depression, binge eating, and self-doubt, and the movement that had relied so heavily on her story was also struggling as she did. Now activists had to figure out how to portray Jazz's breakdown in a society that was desperate for easy stories. Some activists redoubled their efforts, arguing that Jazz's suffering was not a result of her gender transition, but rather of a world that was still rife with transphobia, and that, if anything, her struggles demonstrated the need for greater funding, support, and visibility. While some LGBTQ organizations, once eager to highlight Jazz's story in brochures or school curriculum, quietly distanced themselves from her because she no longer fit the neat archetype of happy trans teen becomes happy trans adult. Others argued that Jazz was a pioneer, wounded not by her path but by society's cruelty. The political arena watched as conservative commentators used Jazz's obvious suffering to argue against gender-affirming care for minors, recirculating clips from I Am Jazz. Her tears, her weight gain, and her isolation were inconvenient realities in a culture still struggling to demonstrate that transition can lead to wholeness. Headlines said, "Look what they did to her." To them, Jazz was no longer a hope and a case study, but an overreach. She was a tragic prop in culture war arguments, her voice muted as both sides screamed over her image, and Jazz herself had become more and more tired, expressing in private moments that she was exhausted not only from her struggles, but also from the weight of being a symbol at all. After almost 20 years in the spotlight, Jazz's identity was no longer her own. It belonged to panels, classrooms, state houses, and online forums. She had been given a new kind of gender, representative, a role no child should ever be forced to carry. "I just want to be me," she said once quietly. "Not someone people debate about." A family split by advocacy for years, the Jennings family was portrayed as a cohesive unit, steadfast allies, navigating a hostile world for the sake of their transgender daughter. However, after enduring the procedures, the applause, the trauma, and the backlash, the question still stands: who is Jazz Jennings when the cameras finally stop? To the outside world, their home was a model of unconditional love and progressive parenting, a place of press interviews, medical planning, affirmation, and TV production meetings. But the cracks were always there. They were just not visible in the highlight reels. Jazz's mother, Jeanette Jennings, had always been the loudest voice in the family. As the gatekeeper from the start, she coordinated hormone treatments, pushed for surgery, and defended her own and Jazz's choices to skeptics on national television and online. In interviews, she portrayed herself as a warrior mother, unyielding, passionate, and protective. But as Jazz's physical and emotional struggles grew more intense, so did Jeanette's frustration. Later seasons of I Am Jazz showed viewers moments that were startlingly raw, with Jeanette sitting across from her daughter in the kitchen, her voice rising, her face flushed with exhaustion, saying, "I've been through this with you too long, you're just making excuses." Jazz, blanketed and overcome with sadness, doesn't answer. The dynamic between mother and daughter had changed, and it wasn't just a family argument. It was a symbol of something deeper, of the unseen conflict between love and control, protection and projection. Jeanette had long been a trans advocate, but now critics started to question whether it was about Jazz's welfare or maintaining a narrative they had all vowed to tell. Even supporters were forced to confront difficult questions. Had Jazz been caught up in a wave of affirmation so strong that even her parents failed to recognize when she needed to take a break? A growing chorus of people online accused Jeanette of going too far in her rush to defend and promote, calling her the stage mom of a movement. Every tantrum, every therapy session, every embarrassing confession was broadcast on television, packaged for mass consumption, and other family members displayed signs of fatigue, while Jazz's siblings voiced concern in whispered tones. A woman so enmeshed in the story of progress that she was unable to let go even as her daughter quietly unraveled. The public had once viewed the Jennings as a symbol of hope, but now her father, Greg, who had once been a soothing counterpoint to Jeanette's intensity, seemed more and more checked out in episodes, silently watching rather than stepping in. The family's emotional center had moved, and no one was sure where to stand. Now they appeared as they really were, a family caught up in the media, advocacy, and irrevocable decisions, a family attempting to provide for their daughter, while coping with the fallout from making her a national celebrity. And the most agonizing question, which hung like a ghost, was whether Jazz had been given the opportunity to develop naturally, or if she had been accelerated because the world needed a story more than it needed her to be whole. It would be oversimplified to describe Jazz Jennings' story as tragic. It is a reflection of the impossible burden placed on a child, not just to survive, but to symbolize an entire movement. Jazz was never permitted to be just a person. From the age of 6 onward, she was presented as a hero, a revolutionary, and an impending success story.